Thanks for being here. My name is Allison Sansoni. I'm the program director at the American Writers Museum. I'd like to thank everyone for being here today at the American Writers Festival and for joining us in this program. This program is presented in partnership with the Poetry Foundation. We thank them for their support. A critical part of the mission of the American Writers Museum is supporting the writers of the future. Through our education programs, including our new Write-In curriculum, we encourage young people to meet the writers of the past and draw inspiration from them and take authorship of their own stories. The National Student Poets Program is the nation's highest honor for young poets, grades 10 to 11, creating original work. Annually, 5 students are selected for 1 year of service, each representing a different geographic region of the country. The program believes in the power of youth voices to create and sustain meaningful change and supports them in being heard. We are pleased to welcome Aanika Eragam, is a senior at Milton High School in Milton, Georgia, who serves as the 2021 National Student Poet for the Southeast. Kevin Gu is a Chinese American from Boston and the 2021 National Student Poet of the Northeast. Kechi Mbah is a senior at Carnegie Vanguard High School and a Houston native. Sarah Fathima Mohammed, daughter of Indian Muslim immigrants, is the 2021-22 National Student Poet representing the West region. They're joined to read today by poet and educator Tina Boyer-Brown, the creative writing department head and a founding teacher at the Chicago High School for the Arts. She's the lead teacher for the Summer Poetry Institute for Educators in Chicago, sponsored by the Poetry Foundation. Her work has appeared in the Journal of Education, Rhino Poetry, and Poetry Magazine. Please join me in welcoming them to the stage.
We each get our own microphone. Okay, this is good. All right, I'm Tina Boyer-Brown, as you might guess, because I'm the old one here. An update on my bio. I'm currently the artistic director at the Chicago High School for the Arts. I was the founding creative writing department head. Our creative writing department head is now Kenyatta Rogers, who is an exceptional poet and educator. Google his work. Okay, so let's hear from these poets. Now, I want to say first about being named National Student Poets. Sometimes when you live a life as an adult, it is easy to dismiss the work of younger people as practice or trying. But all of us here who write, like we're surely not the only ones in this room, know that it's all practice. It's all trying. And I will tell you, the work that we hear written by teenagers in general, and these teenagers in particular, they're not just the future, they're now. These are the writers writing. These are the ones making sense of what's happening now. You'll see, you'll hear. Okay, you'll hear. So, without further ado, the first thing I'd like us to do is hear from each poet. I'm going to introduce Aanika first. Aanika, will you please tell us something about your work and read us a poem?
Yes. Hello, everyone. It's very nice to be here with you today. My name is Aanika. I am the National Student Poet for the Southeast from Atlanta, Georgia. I'm the daughter of Indian immigrants, and a lot of my poetry and work has begun as a way to connect with my cultural heritage. I write a lot about identity, heritage, culture, family, migration, and finding a sense of home. And I'm going to be reading a poem called When You Wish Upon a Star. When you wish upon a star. 1. In the backyard, evening splits yolk-like over the sea of switchgrass. A lone dandelion shoots up from the porch slats. I crush it in my fist and blow. I am thinking about mother, about unborn sister, about storks that chuck babies from the sky into eager arms, the homes they miss, or the baskets that are empty to begin with. Winter 2 years before I was born, Mother cast a wish on a star long dead, and that is why I am the eldest, instead of Leela, whose sonogram she still keeps in a shoebox. 2. Father once told me of his grade school days spent scaling rooftops, all to steal glances from the lone television on the block, flickering in his neighbor's window like wildfire. I picture him fresh-faced, youthful, breath caught like a guppy in a fisherman's reel each time the credits rolled. Now, he buries away after dusk, action films droning, and I imagine he sees a supernova in every fight scene, a jaw shattering into a million constellations, colliding with another's knuckle, the space where his fist could have been. He says, it wasn't written in my stars. He says, there's no use pining, but he hurries to the theater every weekend, basks in the screen's glare like sunshine on a cold afternoon. 3. Once a month, cousin calls to ask if she can visit, says she can't stand the empty cavern of her one-bedroom apartment in Detroit, the wedding band glinting on her finger like the scales of a python coiled tight around prey it will not kill, but choke. She's forgotten the slope of her husband's face, my cousin. Like last year, his visa denied. I picture them both as mantids, eyes bulbous, upturned, fingers clasped and reaching. Same sky, same prayer. 4. On the porch steps now, I thumb the lines fraying like roots on my palm, gaze at the freckled expanse of night, trace constellations, Orion, the Little Dipper. Can't decide which part of this poem I hate the most, the way they sigh or the way they hope, the way they hold my gaze like a promise, like something they're owed.
What'd I tell you? Okay, let's hear from Kevin. Kevin.
Hi everyone, my name is Kevin Gu. I'm the National Student Poet of the Northeast, and I am from Boston. So what I usually like to say is that I hope to create literature until every story in my body is released. So by that, I kind of mean that I write a lot about memory, about stories, a lot about ancestral history, kind of rich anecdotes of my past, of my family, and a lot of that also has to do with culture and identity as well. So that's what my work primarily focuses on. Today I'll be reading a poem called The Yangtze. The Yangtze. 1. The first time I dipped my toes in the Yangtze, my mother told me the story of Qu Yuan, a great poet who drowned himself along the branching twines of the river. I laughed at her, split grinned, and submerged my legs anyway. Later that night, I dreamt of jasmine rice and zongzi. 2. Indigo means immensity. Mother cooked ma po doufu for me when the winters were still long. the middle stages of twilight at 5 p.m. Some rusty heater pumped rivulets of smoky air, scent lingering in my lungs like Yinghua syrup. Her calloused fingertips kneaded my fleshy face while the rest of the world was quiet, only us alone in the house. 3. Mouth gaping under the light year skies, taste the moon's perspiration, it tells me, it grips me. They all want something, the Yangtze said to me that day. Mother stroked my burnt hair, blackened soot on the thin skin of my under eyes. Find yourself in the infinite, or it will drive you under the currents. 4. The silky black felt frozen between my toes. Changjiang was its other name. Mother told me it meant long river, long falling, long gone. Fish nipped on peach-frosted skin as inward legs held the weight of the horizon. The listless sky spun around two axes, one centered above me, another piercing my side, asymmetric. Indigo split like gears, grinding flaked sugar stars. My chest trembled, eyes closed at the sight of the undertow. Why did Qu Yuan drown himself? The Yangtze answered over and over and over. He yearned for the sky and found the next closest thing.
Thank you. Now you know you can all sit or you can stand. It's up to you. Depends on your work, right? I'm just saying, we're not stuck in these chairs. All right, Kechi.
Hello, my name is Kechi. I'm from Houston, Texas, and I like to describe my work as focusing on making the known strange and chronicling the history of my ancestors. And today I'll be reading a poem titled My Great-Grandfather Had 9 Wives. My great-grandfather had 9 wives. Until the lions have their own historians, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. Chinue Achebe. Egwu adira atoafo oburu uzo. My great-grandfather's squinting eyes drew haze over the horizon belonging to my great-grandmother, creating a painting of African sun. She was a woman of the earth made woman of her. Dirt-laced fingers and sand-peppered knees spoke love to corn and cassava, praying only to the God she held within her bosom. At the rise of afternoon, pestle etched callous as she pounded fufu into brown freckled mortar. Like all men, my great-grandfather admired, his yellowed eyes enchanted by her flat nose and cow-belly plump lips, to her skin peeled ripe from ebony and hips swept wide for birth, to the sweet smell of a hard-working woman. So he grew chests and 3 goats to bring back to her village, and she agreed to be his 7th wife. Otu mi wete bele. Drums beat to the laughter of pot-bellied men. Wine carrying is the wedding. My great-grandfather squatted hidden in mariah bush leaves, while my great-grandmother's feet kissed the ground to its pulsing rhythm. Red wrapper bouncing to her waist, palm wine swimming in the ivory tusk of her forefathers. She searched through purple plume grass and behind corkwood trees, only finding men pretending to be my great-grandfather, until the rustle of mariah bush leaves seized her eyes, tusk weighed his hands, palm wine touched his lips, and a river stretched out around their families. Umanu akara dioto, onyeratu, ibeyararatu. My great-grandfather's land can make a village, splitting vast of dust-rich colors, for each wife had a house of her own, and they stuck together tightly. Clay, woman, bamboo stick children, leading to feasts that were long and winding. sun-fed siblings chasing behind the shadows of their mothers, and snapping stomachs waiting for their dent of gari to be filled with okra soup. The open air hugging them tenderly. Thank you.
Sarah Fathima.
My name is Sarah Fathima Mohammed, and I am the National Student Poet representing the West region. I think I've been thinking a lot about what home means and what it means to find home not in a place but in your people and in your poems. And I always felt growing up like words were a place that I could put everything I loved, my family, my village hometown, where I could exist in that space even when I wasn't able to return there every day. And so I've been thinking about the way poetry makes me feel rooted to a home and makes me feel like my people are always around me. I'm going to be reading my poem, and it's called Ode to Muslim Girl. Ode to Muslim Girl. In the mosque, women stir in slow circles, following the blue lilt of my mother's cotton hijab. I move past these women, their burqas brushing against mine, their bodies so lovely and gentle, their mouths brimming with sweet Tamil vowels and knitted songs of worship. I kneel beside my mother, tucked in the corner of the room, both of us curling and uncurling our hands, our prayer rug afield, tendrilled in sea silk. We are here, I murmur, skimming my thumb along her jaw, and by this I mean we are home. On days like these, the air heavy as pearls, heavy as daughters, I keep looking into my mother's face, so warm and so dark, and I am overcome with the softness of her, the way she opens the last verses of the Quran, moon-clotted and steamed in rose milk, the way she cradles my cheek, a small synonym, the way she murmurs back to me, we are here, the words settling over me, like skin. And I remember the softness. I cling to the memory of the softness when, after school, I struggle against the boy in the empty classroom until he relents, until he moves the hard meat of his knuckles from my waist, my body so small and trembling. When he asks where I am going, the answer is a tender thing blooming in my mouth. And he responds, have fun with all the other terrorists. His chuckle following me, like footsteps filling the damp streets. As I trudge to the mosque, slip into the prayer room, my mother coiling close. The prayer rug becomes a garden growing underneath us, a smattering of pink petals pinned to our bare feet, gentle as touch.
I feel really lucky to be up here with these writers right now. Okay, listen. So, what's the best or most fun thing about writing poetry? For me, it is, if I can make it work, I can literally do anything I want. What about you?
I think I have to say the best thing about writing is sharing it. I think, like, I write poetry, but I also do slam poetry, and so I think seeing the way that you, like, move a room, or the way that someone, like, tells you about, like, your writing and, like, how it impacted them, and I think that's really, like, the best thing about poetry and writing.
Yeah, I would echo what Kechi just said and also add that I've always been drawn to poetry because it exists at the intersection of so many like art forms to me. You know, there's like the musicality of it with the lyricism of poetry and the performance of poetry that comes into how it's like interpreted. There's also visually like, you know, the way you're spacing out your poem, the way it looks on the page always adds and enhances so much. So thinking about kind of all of these different elements, it always feels kind of like putting together like a puzzle for me. And I enjoy that aspect of creating poetry.
I think there's also something so beautiful about finding in the poem something that you didn't know. I feel like I always start the poem exploring and wandering. I'll have like a line or something in my mind, and then there will be a point in the poems that feel like most exciting, where you realize like this was what it was about the whole time. This was what I was writing towards. This is the question I was asking, and it's not you necessarily who unlocks it, but it's something in the poem, and you just realize the magic of the art form.
Yeah, so for me, it's kind of how it builds a sense of connection with other people. Poetry is something so warm and tender, and it can really build communities. I think, like, for me, like, from looking at people from all different walks of life, from every corner of the earth, you know, we can be brought together through language and through storytelling. And I guess for me, that's what draws me to poetry the most. The fact that I can even be here today with so many people who have a love for this language, so many, you know, fellow students who find joy and find warmth through writing is just something so meaningful and beautiful.
Thank you. Right? So I have paper because I am past the time where I can see everything on my phone. I'm going to read a poem. Also, if you would like to ask the poets questions, there's a microphone there. You will have to line up to ask them, and we'll take questions. I'm going to read this poem. It's a segue into my next question for our poets. This poem is called School 1215. Now, what I will say about it is, I'd revised it a million times. And by a million, I mean like 15, okay? And I change the title a little bit every time. Now this title, School 1215. And I spoke to a class of 9th graders in West Virginia on the internet. So I was in Google. And they said, well, what's the title? And I'm like, well, it's lunchtime. Remote learning lunchtime. But it also sounds like a Bible verse. Because during remote learning, school is like a prayer. School. 12:15. Imagine the lunchroom, crowded and wary, seating charts, a welcome apprehension. Loose leaf paper spiraled from ballpoint stretched notebook covers until the last hour when a teacher sighed and sighed. Today we close our backpacks, but minutes come quick and quit the ease of dawn. So I read that poem because I got it to where it wanted to be during the pandemic, right? And like Sarah, it became something that I didn't know was going to be. So I wanted to ask you, because it was about the quiet of not being in school, but being in school. And one of the things the students I talked to who wanted to know what the title was about, December 15th is one of the dates of one of the school shootings, right, I believe. And so they thought it was about that, because that is about the quiet of school. Sort of the work resonates beyond us, and connects with current events in ways we intend or don't. How is the world, our current events, is that something you look at, and how do they affect or not affect your work? And if you don't want to answer that, how did the pandemic affect your work?
So current events definitely do affect my work. One of the poems that I wrote was titled Georgia Atlanta Ululation, and that poem was written after the spa parlor shootings in Atlanta, Georgia, back in March of last year. I wrote that poem the night that it happened, or that I learned of it, and it really was something so striking, so shocking, and I was very upset. I think my whole family was upset. My community was upset. And that flow of emotions ended up translating onto paper. You know, I couldn't find a way to voice it other than through writing, through poetry, through language. It helped me find a voice, looking at current events, you know, looking at things that pertain to me, and having it written down in my own voice allows me to process it. It allows me to speak out, to have my voice heard, to vocalize. And it also allows me to use poetry as a tool for strength, for might. To have this kind of device, this outlet for me to be able to speak in. So yes, I do look at current events, and it is something that is pretty important to me, actually, when I write my poetry.
I think there's also a bravery that I find when I write poetry, in that sometimes I find myself faltering when someone asks me about my opinion on a current event, and I say, I'm not sure where I stand right now. But then when I have the stillness that poetry gives me, I find rooting, I find a place to stand and a place to stay and a place to watch and a place to feel home. And that sense of comfort and belonging really teaches me what I feel about the world, and has helped me, I think, realize what I'll be standing for and what are the tenets that I hold close to myself. So I think poetry really offers a stillness in a world that is often moving so quickly and so rapidly that you feel like sometimes you're losing your footing. And I think for young people, we need a place to stand, and poetry is a way to feel held and to feel rooted while the world is moving beyond us.
And I just kind of wanted to touch on both of what they said, but I think in terms of like current events, I've definitely used poetry as a point of connection. I remember during the summer of 2020, when there were protests following the death of George Floyd, and he was a Houstonian, so I remember essentially like really seeing how my city reacted in a sense, but also at the same time, that's when the SARS protests were happening in Nigeria, which is where I draw my ancestry from, and my parents were born. And I think I wrote a poem called like Lagos and Houston, My Cities in Protest, and it was like each stanza was a different city, but like seeing like the similarities, but the differences, but like both this, like a protest for, you know, bettering your country and like the way they treat certain things. So I think I've definitely used poetry as a point of connection in current events and in points of my identity. And relating to the pandemic, I do think the pandemic gave me a lot of time to think and a lot of time to write, sort of figure out, what's important to me and what stories that I want to get out there. And so I think it really helped me grow as like a person, but also as a writer, and that growth happened through my writing.
Yeah. I would say for me, poetry is definitely like intertwined with current events. One of the like poems that's coming to mind that I wrote was during the time of Kamala Harris's election. There was this line that had gone around in the media, and I'm from Georgia, so like our senator from Georgia had kind of been mocking her name and being like, Kamala, like, I don't know, whatever. So like, it doesn't matter, like how we say her name. And that made me think of this larger like idea of like erasure, and how poetry kind of gave me a moment to take up space in the face of that erasure. Because I ended up writing a poem with that specific line as the epigraph to the poem. And the poem didn't mention any like specifics of like the election, but this larger idea of being able to have this space to respond and hold on to what it is that you would like to say back when normally we might not get that chance to say anything back. Like, it's carving out a space where you can say it regardless of whether that's like kind of like offered to you.
Thank you. It makes the discourse more whole, right? Here we are experiencing the world all together, and your voices are in the conversation, even in when there are people who would not let them in, but they're still in because you are writing, you get to say. So think about, I see in each of your work the idea of ancestry and the idea of culture. And I'm wondering, too, about who your literary ancestors are. So for me, Audre Lorde, like if I could, when I want to feel rooted in, like, I'm going to make a new poem, and I want it to feel like home, I'm going to go read Audre Lorde for inspiration. Who are your literary ancestors?
Oh my gosh, I have so many. I feel like reading makes me realize what poems can do, and I love it for that. Some of my favorite poets are Safia El-Hello, Fatima Asghar, Arya Aber, for the way they explore what it means to be Muslim, but also just what it means to be human and what it means to live here. I love listening to their readings, reading their books, and a reminder that poetry is unapologetic and you can show up fully and be whole on the page is what I think I've learned from them. And I'd say my biggest literary ancestor is my mother, who taught me everything about language and stories and what stories do and how they move you, and how stories can really be a way to survive. And the way that she would tell me about a memory or an anecdote, they were things that we carried in our bodies for generations, and things that brought us joy and brought us hope, but also brought us what we needed, gave us what we needed in our bodies to survive, and to be able to be here. So she's really taught me the power of language.
I guess this is going to be sort of different. I think a lot of the writers I draw inspiration from are around my age. I think, I don't know, like when I usually read novels, or when I was younger, it was definitely like characters based on my age. And with poetry, I think I've sort of like been drawn to poets around my age, and I guess to name a few poets that I really like, I'd have to say like Imani Davis, Ari Lor, Samuel Getachew, and I think it's not even necessarily like the topic I might relate to, but I think the way in which they say things, and maybe that connection is drawn because we're close in age. I do read poets from like all ages, but I do think I find a stronger connection to poets around my age, yeah.
Yeah, so this is a really hard question always, just because there are so many, people that have touched me in a multitude of different ways. If I could point out one main inspiration, I always say this, is Ocean Vuong. His work is so delicate and tender, and he just touches upon so many huge topics, grief, loss, family, history, war, in such intricate ways. And it's something that I really drew inspiration from when I first started reading and writing poetry. But yeah, he's just really, really wonderful. A few other poets that I really love are Philip Booth. He's really good with kind of touching upon, elements of nature and the universe. And then also I love Ming Chang, just because she's amazing. So those are just a few of my kind of literary heroes. And yeah.
Yeah, I would also agree that there's so many to even begin to name. But one that's coming to mind is I've really been inspired by the work of Tarfia Faizullah. I generally gravitate more towards poets who also write about cultural background or heritage, or poets from a South Asian background, especially when I began to write, because those were the stories I wanted to tell as well. Faizullah really explores a lot of history, which is something I've always found poetry to be a really great vehicle for, to go also into the past, to comment on the present. And Faizullah did that. She interviewed a bunch of survivors of the Liberation War and created this collection of poetry that was very in touch with these people who had not been given that ability to take up that space with their stories, and she helped be a vehicle for that. And I find myself very inspired by her work.
For sure, me too. The poets that I'm reading, the people you are reading, and I agree. Before we hear the work from our poets, we're going to hear another poem shortly. I just want to note, part of having voices in the literary world and literary discourse, I'm just going to be on my soapbox for about 5 seconds here, 30 seconds, is, and we hear so much in sort of the political zeitgeist as the pendulum is swinging towards more restrictive readings of what culture and art and literature are supposed to be. And what I will say to you all, and what I will say to you, is that when people try to keep out writers of color, LGBTQ writers, disabled writers, women, then they are pretending the actual work that is happening doesn't exist. This is where the work is. The writers here on the stage, the writers each of them spoke of, this is the work that is being made. This is the literature. And so when people talk about banning certain books, we are pretending that literature only exists in a place that is preserved in amber, not necessarily reflective of the world that we live in. So That's my soapbox. Okay. Can we hear more poems from each of you? You ready?
Okay, so this poem is called Inheritance. It is an ekphrastic poem, so it's actually after a painting by Abir Karmarkar called Passage in 2020. And for a little bit of context, the speaker, like in the painting, there's this portrait of, at least in my poem, like assumed to be like a grandmother or a ancestral figure. And so that is kind of who the speaker is speaking to in this poem. Inheritance. Shrine swung open. You taught me to rank my prayers in order of advantage. Begin with the demons, end with the gods. Better, you said, to convince drought of another direction than howl for rain in dead summer, with no slick, no sweat left to sacrifice. I trusted this, trusted you like a myth without origin. Beneath worn fingernails, found the moral of your story etched in grime. Even with a billowing harvest, a firstborn son, a husband who adorns you in silks, nothing is promised. I had 3 unwed daughters when your grandfather succumbed to rust. You told me to savor, so I entombed every wilting rose from the garden, trapped salty grenades of sunflower seeds beneath my tongue. And when we went to the Ganga, pouring ashes in the mud, I stopped at the river's edge because you warned me not to trust my own lungs. Listen to me now. I once took a knife in my hand and it fit more snugly than my lover's palm. I am tired of fearing an empty sky. Oh, this cursed inheritance. How can I bear it but to believe in our own blessing? Let me be a fool, call the mirage an oasis. Here's the truth. I never unwrapped the idol from the bazaar, but I do write the Ramakoti at dawn. Believe only a little less in you than in God. We did always butt heads, 2 stallions running opposite in the dark.
So this is a poem. It's called They Crushed Stars in Their Fists and Watched Them Collapse. And it's written after, speaking of current events, it's written after the Sunset Park shooting in New York. Obviously, that shooting was just one in a sequence of events that kind of targeted Asian Americans. Elders, beaten up, Asian woman pushed onto the subway rails. This is just kind of another event that occurred in conjunction with those. And I wrote a poem about it. They crushed stars in their fists and watched them collapse. And by stars, I mean my people. And by fists, I mean watch their hands close like a palm squeezing dandelion seeds and blow stars like seeds. Trigger finger like a vise over skin yellow as starlight, as day warmed sand, bone crushed to brittle glass. I cling to the May wind like a forsaken home, a longing for this war to finally end, and wait for the shores to stop wearing the sand away, as they always do. Feel the weight, a hush of breath before you held a body, unmoving in your own eyes for the first time. The rage that followed, a dense thing searching for space to swallow. It, a dirty crow, hungering, black teeth snarling into flesh. So I swallow heaviness like a stone when, tonight, Channel 5, I hear, suns are stars that burn too close. Watch these bodies, once brilliant suns, burning away, and we can't let it happen again. We can't. For strum your fingers through red raw rivers like it's New York and its Sunset Park, and picture this, so many stars, so many, and it's a park of suns setting under the subway rails, coalescing into a fistful of skin, a collapse in silence. 死 means to die, in a tongue long, scraped tender. So if you carry anything away, remember just this. Somewhere in a pitch yellow tunnel, a mother cries over her mother, alone.
This poem, the next poem I'm going to read, it's titled Graffiti, and it's inspired by the poem I Do Not Know the Spelling of Money by Tonga Ison Martin. Graffiti. I'm first discovered in the exhale of a baby-faced reflection in some anticipated movement we call arriving at womanhood, fastened to the speed of his words. My new existence is living graffiti. I hold myself through sideways glances, soften in brief fixtures with unfamiliar eyes. To be a beggar, I believe, is to unhook oneself, to let a want hunger away your presence, which is to wish I'd never begged before, never lost myself between the breaths of my own trembling voice. So once a new world wants to give, I'll try to keep what's mine, outline my halves in different places, neon down a steady washed skin, in an attempt to say, I must decipher more than silence, spray all of this along the exhale of then and now. So today's awash in memories, and I vandalize the mirror.
I think I've been thinking a lot about joy in poems and what it means to give space to joy and the joy of my people and the way I've always wanted to save that, to immortalize it on paper. So I wrote a poem about my grandmother called In Kumbakonam, Uma Boils Water. In Kumbakonam, Uma boils water for baths, white burqa swarming her wrists, flood of cotton, a dollop of steam and froth from the vessel glazing her upper lip. Every few minutes she dips her fingers into the water, testing. Finally, it bloats her skin with heat, and she coaxes out the liquid to bestow to us, wooden spoon sitting gently in her palm. We will mix this water in the cold tap to wash our bodies. We will think of Ummah as we pour it over our backs, palmful by palmful, creek settling in the dimples of our skin. It will stay with us. The way the water cares for the backs of our necks, softening all the little places of our bodies, its warmth lurching from the bowl like Ummah's embracing us, hand in our hair, us coming away shining, sun-soaked as the seawater she leaves on the porch to bring the ocean into our home. All night, gathered together on the bed, the beginnings of sleep lulling us, we watched through the window glorious and humming that Tamil song in our backyard, frosted leaves melting under her touch, glistening like a small unbloomed bouquet, a gift she will press to the middle of the kitchen table, another warm thing she has made for us.
Audience, thank you so much for being here. Can we please give our poets another round of applause? Our time is up. You all did amazing. Thank you very much, and thank you. Have a wonderful day.